statement, the Government of Canada stated it had a reasonable basis for declaring a public order emergency. Unfortunately, a reasonable basis is not necessarily a legal, let alone a constitutional basis for assuming unprecedented and destructive emergency powers. I would like to briefly quote in part the correct legal standard in these circumstances for threats to the security of Canada that constitute a public order emergency. Quote, activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence. Not tied to serious acts of violence in some fashion. Not in conjunction with or somehow associated in some fashion with. Rather, directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence. We are here to receive in public the evidence from the Government of Canada related to the correct legal standard for the proclamation of a public order emergency. And the rule of law requires nothing less. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Next, if I could call on the Canadian Civil Liberties Association.
My job to be the comic relief. So good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, Commission Council, members of the public. My name is Kara Zwiebel, and I, along with my co-counsel, Eva Krajeska, who is participating remotely, are representing the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We will be participating primarily remotely starting next week, but do anticipate attending in person for portions of the coming weeks. And we look forward to participating in the fact-finding role of the Commission and expect to play a particularly active role in the Commission's policy phase and forward-looking functions. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, or CCLA, is a national, independent, non-governmental organization that is dedicated to the protection and promotion of fundamental rights and freedoms in Canada. The CCLA has been engaged in this important work since its founding in 1964 and is known for taking principled stands on difficult issues that require reconciling fundamental rights with other competing interests. The Commission is aware that the CCLA has sought judicial review of the decision to declare a public order emergency and argues that the Act's legal threshold was not met and that the emergency orders that were put in place by the government breached constitutional rights in a manner that was not reasonable or justified. The CCLA's interest in the Commission's work comes from our concern about the use of emergency powers that circumvent the parliamentary processes and allow the executive branch to rule by fiat. It is a concern that has been around for as long as the organization has existed, and although the excesses of the War Measures Act are now well understood, during the FLQ crisis itself, the CCLA was one of the lone voices critical of the use of that law. As a result of that experience, the organization participated actively in the process that led to the passage of the current Emergencies Act. In particular, the CCLA encouraged Parliament to build meaningful oversight and accountability mechanisms into the Act and to require a high and judicially reviewable threshold for declaring a national emergency. There are many issues that the Commission will be examining which are central to CCLA's work, including the lawful scope of the right to protest, the role of police in facilitating protests while protecting public safety, the relationship between policing authorities, civilian oversight bodies, and government actors, and the surveillance of those involved in dissenting social movements. More broadly, the CCLA's interest in the Commission's work goes to the core of the organization's mandate, protecting the rights and freedoms of Canadians and demanding transparency and accountability from our governments. The CCLA views the Commission as an instrumental part of achieving the goals of transparency and accountability, and our participation in the Commission's proceedings will be aimed at supporting those goals. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to call on the Democracy Fund, Citizens for Freedom, and JCCF Coalition, please.
Good morning, Commissioner. If there's no objection, I'd like to call my colleagues up from the Democracy Fund and Citizens for Freedom. We had all prepared very brief introductions of ourselves and our organizations and should come in well under the time allotted for a single party.
I won't repeat the comments I made earlier. I think you're well aware that from now on it will be one presentation rather than three. And for today, I'll make the exception I made in the previous case. Go
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm Rob Kittredge. I represent the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And since 2010, the Justice Center has defended the fundamental rights of Canadians through pro bono litigation. A team of Justice Center lawyers were on the ground in Ottawa for the duration of the protests here, and our lawyers have been and continue to be involved in much of the related litigation. We look forward to continuing to defend the rights and freedoms of Canadians here at this inquiry and holding the government to account on its invocation of the Emergencies Act. It likely comes as no surprise that we view the invocation of the Act to have been an unjustified infringement on the fundamental rights of Canadians. I'm joined here today by my co-counsel, James Manson, and my co-counsel, Hatem Kir, is following online. We will each be here in person at various times throughout the inquiry, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues at the Democracy Fund and Citizens for Freedom.
Okay.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Antoine Dailly, counsel together with Amanda Armstrong to Citizens for Freedom, representing a not-for-profit organization representing the interests and perspectives of the peaceful demonstrators in Windsor, Ontario. We are here to assist the Commission in fulfilling its mandate, particularly its fact-finding function as it relates to the protests that occurred in Windsor, which culminated in the widely publicized demonstration near the Ambassador Bridge, and the various corresponding responses by the various levels of government and law enforcement. Citizens for Freedom is here to advance the interest of truth and transparency and to assist this Commission in producing a balanced and accurate public record.
Commissioner. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Honor, and I am the Litigation Director for the Democracy Fund. The Democracy Fund is a registered charity and a civil liberties organization. As you've heard, we're sharing standing with the JCCF and with Citizens for Freedom. Our interest in this inquiry arises from our legal work. In February of 2022, we sent lawyers to Ottawa and to Windsor to provide demonstrators with legal information about their rights when protesting, as well as the limitations of those rights. Around the same time, we were granted intervener status as a friend of the court at the Superior Court of Justice in Windsor over the Ambassador Bridge injunction proceeding. Currently, we represent dozens of persons who have been criminally charged in relation to the protests at Ottawa, Windsor, and Coutts. And we represent thousands of others who've been charged under the Quarantine Act or provincial offenses related to the pandemic. We've also brought applications before Superior Courts and the Federal Court of Canada, challenging laws related to the pandemic. Our objective is to participate in the fact-finding process of this inquiry, particularly as it relates to uncovering the truth about why the federal government invoked a public order emergency and how they used their powers. From our perspective, the government did not meet the requisite legal grounds to invoke a public order emergency for the same reasons you heard from counsel for the Freedom Corps. It follows that the extraordinary measures the government invoked were therefore inappropriate and indeed outside their jurisdiction. Our questions and our submissions will focus on these central issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I understand there are three other parties to the proceedings who have, in some cases, more limited involvement and interest in the proceedings, either for mostly the policy end. And they're not present today either in person or by video, as I understand it. They would be the government of Manitoba, which I referred to earlier, as well as the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So that, with those three, that makes up the roster, if you like, of parties with standing. I want to just first say I'm grateful to the parties for the assistance that they have given the Commission to date, and for what I hope will be continued assistance. Anyone who had the illusion that this would be easy and uncontroversial, I think the presentations have started to lay out some of the differences and issues. It's a challenge, but it's one which the Commission is eager to take on. Ça nous fait certainement plaisir d'avoir.
We are quite happy to have these various parties who have obtained standing before the Commission. And there are certainly many perspectives, but they're all welcome to try to address all the issues and challenges to come to a solution. And the Commission is really happy to take on this challenge.
I think we'll now turn to the beginning of what I will call the evidentiary phase. And the first is more through the presentation, as you've heard, as I understand it, of various reports. So I'll turn it over to Commission Counsel now to take us to the next step.
Thank you, Commissioner. To begin, I would ask our Senior Commission Counsel, Daniel Shepherd, to present and deduce into evidence an overview report on the emergence of COVID-19 and the various public health measures implemented in Canada in response to it.
Mr. Commissioner, parties, members of the public, good morning. My name is Daniel Shepherd. I am Senior Commission Counsel with the Public Order Emergency Commission. Today, we will be introducing into evidence 3 overview reports, and we anticipate that additional overview reports will be put into evidence in the days and weeks to follow. The first is a report on the COVID-19 pandemic and public health responses. Next slide, please. Because we're going to be spending some time today putting overview reports into evidence, I'd like to take a moment to discuss with members of the public what an overview report is and how it works within the Commission. You have already heard that the timelines that the Commission is working under are tight, and that not every witness that the Commission might hear from will in fact be called. There are large bodies of evidence that exist, often in writing, and entire topics that need to be explored by the Commission, but it would be impracticable to call live evidence in order to put it before the Commissioner. Previous commissions of inquiry have adopted the procedure of overview reports, documents created by Commission staff that collect, collate, and summarize large bodies of information into documents that may be more or less concise, so that they can be reviewed by the Commissioner, the parties, and the public to understand a particular area of relevance to the Commission. The Public Order Emergency Commission has adopted this procedure, and for those who are interested in technical details about how overview reports work, reference can be made to Rules 41 through 45 of the Commission's revised Rules of Practice and Procedure. I've mentioned that overview reports are created by Commission counsel. After they are prepared, they have been circulated to the parties and we've invited their comment. And for those parties who have provided comment to the overview reports so far, I would like to express the thanks of the Commission. While not all comments have been accepted or are necessarily reflected in finalized overview reports, the feedback that has been provided has been invaluable in ensuring that the Commission puts forward what it believes are high-quality documents before the Commissioner that he can rely upon. Once overview reports have been finalized and are introduced, they do become evidence before the Commission that may be relied upon by the Commissioner and the parties. However, it is important to note that simply because an overview report has been prepared by Commission counsel does not mean that the Commissioner necessarily will accept its contents. Rather, an overview report is, like all other evidence, information before the Commissioner that he may or may not choose to rely on. This means that parties are free to disagree with the content of an overview report and are entitled to challenge its contents. Moreover, in areas where an overview report may not capture relevant information, parties, and indeed Commission counsel, are free to supplement the information contained in them through the ordinary process of the factual inquiry. Next slide, please. With that general introduction out of the way, I would now like to present COM-OR2, the COVID-19 pandemic and public health responses. This overview report summarizes publicly available information about the COVID-19 pandemic around the world and in Canada. The Commission anticipates that a great deal of evidence that it will be hearing will be made in reference to the pandemic and public health measures implemented by various Canadian authorities. This overview report attempts to provide context so that when those discussions take place and that evidence is heard, the Commissioner, the parties, and the public have a factual background to understand what public health measures were in fact in place and what statements about the current public health system around the world and the pandemic were at different points in time. It therefore provides information not only about the pandemic itself and about public health measures, it also provides information about vaccine development and particular measures adopted by Canadian governments and different jurisdictions with respect to COVID vaccines. Next slide. The overview report contains essentially 4 components. The first, which is found at paragraphs 1 through 39 of the overview report, deals specifically with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. It does so in 2 ways. First, it provides a summary overview of international information about the spread of COVID-19 around the globe. And then second, provides background information about the emergence of COVID-19 in Canada. Next slide. On the international side of things, this overview report provides information about the original emergence of a novel coronavirus in late 2019 and its rapid spread throughout the world. It also provides background information about public health declarations and surveillance conducted by organizations, most notably the World Health Organization. This includes the January 30, 2020 declaration of COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern, and the March 11th, 2020 declaration by the World Health Organization of COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. Next slide, please. In Canada, this overview report discusses 2 main timelines. First, it deals with when COVID-19 first emerged in different provinces across the country. With the exception of early provinces such as Ontario and British Columbia, and the territory of Nunavut, which was spared any infections until later in 2020, the overview report notes that most provinces began to be impacted with infections in late February through mid-March. This overview report also outlines when each province and territory first declared a state of emergency under a variety of public health and emergency management statutes in respect of COVID-19. You'll note from the slide that each of these jurisdictions declared some form of emergency throughout March of 2020. Next slide, please. The second part of this overview report, which is found at paragraphs 40 through 108, deals with what we term as the initial public health measures. Next slide, please. Spanning pages 16 through 50 of the overview report, this is a lengthy section, but notwithstanding its length, it's important for Commission Council to emphasize this is not a comprehensive list of every public health measure that was implemented within Canada. Rather, it is limited in a couple of different ways. First, this overview report focuses on public health measures that were adopted from the early declarations of emergency in March 2020 up until the point in time when COVID vaccines began to be approved for distribution and marketing in Canada. Secondly, this section of the overview report, it focuses almost exclusively on public health measures adopted by governments at the provincial and territorial level. Notably, it does not address public health measures adopted by other levels of government, such as municipalities or Indigenous governments. Finally, even within those confines, the overview report does not attempt to outline each and every public health measure adopted within the first year of the pandemic. That would be impossible and would turn the overview report into a largely useless document. To put this in context, in Ontario, the jurisdiction where I live, in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, the provincial government adopted over 200 orders in council specifically dealing with measures in respect to the pandemic. And while I have had the pleasure of reading each and every one of them, it would not necessarily be the best use of the Commission's time to go over them in an overview report. Instead, this overview report focuses on 6 particular types of public health measures that were adopted broadly throughout Canada and had significant impacts on the way Canadians lived their lives. This includes restrictions on travel, both in terms of barriers to entering provinces and territories or requirements to self-isolate, school closures and other types of closures impacting early childcare, limits on gatherings of persons, both in terms of public assemblies and private gatherings, both indoors and outdoors, closures of businesses and other locations, such as the shutdown of indoor dining or prohibitions on use of outdoor recreational amenities, curfews and stay-at-home orders, measures that, while adopted less frequently throughout Canada, did have significant impacts by restricting individuals' rights to leave their home during particular periods or times of the day. And finally, masking requirements, obligations imposed on individuals to wear face coverings in a variety of settings. Next slide. The third portion of this overview report deals with vaccine approvals in Canada. It is found in paragraphs 109 through 123 of the overview report. This section of the overview report deals with 2 broad issues. First, the overview report discusses the process whereby vaccines were considered and approved by Health Canada. Second, it deals with the actual approvals that were in fact made and the vaccines that became available at different points in time for marketing and use. Next slide, please. With respect to the drug approval process, the overview report discusses in very general terms how drug approval operates within Canada under the Food and Drug Regulations, a regulation that is made pursuant to the Food and Drugs Act. Under the Food and Drugs Act, however, the Minister of Health has the authority in Section 30.1 to make something referred to as an interim order. An interim order can be made, and this is the statutory language, quote, if the minister believes that immediate action is required to deal with a significant risk, direct or indirect, to health, safety, or the environment. The overview report discusses that on September 16th of 2020, the Minister of Health made one such interim order with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. The interim order respecting the importation, sale, and advertising of drugs for use in relation to COVID-19 contained a number of rules that were followed by Health Canada in the assessment and ultimate approval of a series of COVID-19 vaccines. Two procedural characteristics of the interim order are of particular note. The first is the rolling application process. In the ordinary drug approval process, Health Canada expects proponents to put forward all relevant clinical information at the time an application is made. Under the interim order, Health Canada allowed for rolling applications, permitting drug companies to provide initial clinical information at the time of an application, but to continue to provide additional information as the application was assessed and prior to final approval. The second procedural alteration was pre-positioning, a measure that permitted the importation of drugs and its positioning throughout Canada, so that in the event a vaccine were approved, doses would already be located at several locations throughout the country. At this point, I'd like to pause to note that on March 17th of 2021, the interim order expired. At that time, the Government of Canada made amendments to the food and drug regulations to incorporate some aspects of the interim order into the ordinary regulatory regime. Next slide, please. The interim order also set out the approval standard for the Minister of Health to apply when approving drugs for use with COVID-19. The standard, in relevant part, was that the minister had to have sufficient evidence to support the conclusion that the benefits associated with the drug outweigh the risks, having regard to the uncertainties relating to the benefits and risks and the necessity of addressing the urgent public health need related to COVID-19. Applying this standard, Health Canada approved a series of drugs for use within Canada. By today, there are currently 6 drugs that have gone through the approval process that began in December 9th of 2020 and most recently occurred on February 24th, 2022, with a drug put forward by the company Medicago. Next slide, please. The fourth and final section of this overview report deals with public health measures specifically related to vaccines, and it can be found at paragraphs 124 through 180 of the overview report. Next slide. Once again, the overview report does not mean to be entirely exhaustive. The purpose of this section of the overview report is to identify certain key public health measures that were specifically tied to individuals' vaccination status. The focus of this section of the overview report is on rules imposed by governments, rules imposed by other types of actors, such as employers of their own accord,